I now call the public portion of the meeting of the Standing Committee on Social Development to order. My name is Caitlin Cleveland, and I am the MLA for Cam Lake and chair of this committee. Today, committee will hear from the Honourable Wozniack, Minister responsible for the status of women, and Ms. Sabet Biscaye for an update on the work plan to address the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls' calls for justice. Today's meeting is being live streamed on the Assembly's social media channels. Due to the COVID-19 situation in the Northwest Territories, we are following the Chief Public Health Officer's gathering restrictions in Yellowknife, and the Legislative Assembly building is closed to the public. I would like to remind all members and presenters to direct all comments, questions, and remarks to myself as chair, and to wait to be recognized before speaking to help the meeting run smoothly. I will now ask members to introduce themselves for the record, starting with MLA Bonnet Rouge.
Ron Bontrus, MLA Techo, Masi.
Good afternoon, everyone. Helen Johnson, MLA for Yellowknife North.
Rocky Simpson, Bay River South.
Lisa Semler, Inuvik Twin Lakes.
Kevin O'Reilly, Frame Lake.
Thank you, members. I will now ask the presenters to introduce themselves and to proceed with any opening remarks they may have, and as well as their presentation. Thank you. Minister Wozniack, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and good afternoon, or I guess still quite here, just good morning to the committee and to anyone that's joining us. Thank you to the committee for organizing. We are very happy to be able to come back and to do this presentation and hope to come back again and again on this particular topic. I don't have very formal opening remarks and I don't have very lengthy ones. I do want to get to the presentation and leave some time for a dialogue. But I did want to just start briefly, obviously, with introducing Sabet Biscaye, who is the director of the Gender Equity Unit, and she'll deliver the presentation today and be able to answer any technical questions that you might have. This is an update for you all as to the status of where we're at in terms of preparing an action plan to respond to the National Inquiry on Murdered Indigenous Girls. You will recall that at one time there was a commitment to have an action plan ready last spring, and as Sabet will get into a bit briefly in the presentation, we did delay that. I asked to delay that. I asked to delay that so that we could have a bit of a check-in on where we were at in the government's work when we were evaluating where we were, what we were doing, what we needed to do. And in my view, check-ins such as this one is yet another opportunity to make sure that we continue to be on a track that makes sense as we go forward. The final plan, the draft plan will be tabled during the upcoming session, and a final plan right now is targeted to be ready for the spring. But even then, as we've said from early days, even that final plan will be a living document. What that means, what does it mean to be a living document when it's still a document? I think that's reflected in the title that we've tentatively selected for the overall plan, which is Changing the Relationship. And Madam Chair, if you think about what a relationship is, I think there's some things that I would hope that we all agree are part of any good relationship. Number one is that relationships change. They are not static things. Human beings are not static things. And they are alive, and their lived experiences continue to change and to mold who they are. And as such, if this is going to be meaningful, it's going to have to change with us. Hopefully, it is also a beginning of change. Actually, that really the way that that government has interacted with citizens, that responses of departments and programs to the needs of citizens historically has not always been one that, that historically leaves something to be desired. This is really a big part of what comes out of the National Inquiry, is just how widespread the shortcomings have been and how long-term and systemic the shortcomings have been to lead to what ultimately was determined to be and defined to be a genocide. And so the changes that need to happen aren't just one single program or one particular service. It's really much more fundamental and broad than that. So again, that's where the title comes from, about changing the relationship, and that's where our vision comes from, that the action plan must continue to change and evolve and be alive, just as our relationship needs to be alive and responsive. So I'll stop there, Madam Chair, since that I hope sets up the vision of where we're going. And again, so that we'll get more into some of those objectives. And then I'll have a few closing remarks at the end before we get to any questions. But with that, Madam Chair, I would like you to ask that you turn this over to Sabet. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Wozniak. Ms. Biscaye?
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to do the presentation and to provide the briefing. And we do welcome comments. I just to introduce myself briefly, I guess my new position and title is Director for the Gender Equity Unit. It used to be the Women's Advisory. It's now the Gender Equity Division. I have a varied background. I'm not going to get into all of it, but I worked in the private sector. I worked for Indigenous government. I've worked for government for a number of years, and also done a lot of contract work and sat on a number of boards and things like that. So I have a varied background. And with this particular file, it has to do with missing murder, Indigenous women and girls. And I do have to admit, I do have lived experience. And so this work is more than about doing my job. It's also making sure that people that are impacted, and it's not just Indigenous women and girls and to us LGBTQ people, there is a ripple effect in that it does affect a lot of people. So this means a lot to me. Before, if I could go into the next slide, please. So just to give a quick outline on the presentation, I'll give a quick background summary. Then we'll speak to the work plan that the minister had mentioned, the one that was tabled on November 4th, 5th of 2020, where we outline what we're going to be doing in order to work on preparing the action plan. Then the preliminary engagement that we were directed to undertake and how that happened and the results of that. And then I'm going to do a summary of what we're doing to prepare the draft action plan. Then I'll talk about a few things that we need to update you on going forward, and then the conclusions. Before I begin, though, I'd just like to, what we do anytime we do presentations is, because of the subject matter, recognize that we don't want to cause further harm. So if anybody needs any emotional support, please call 1-844-413-6649. That's a toll-free number that's available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and that's manned constantly. So if anybody needs it, please feel free to use that number. Okay, the next slide, please. I'll begin with the background summary. I will try to get through the slides. I recognize we have limited time, so I'll try to go through as much as I can without leaving out important details. So as you all know, the final report of the National Inquiry into Missing Murder of Indigenous Women and Girls was released on June 3rd of 2019. It's called Reclaiming Power and Place. And when we're talking about words, like the word reclaiming power and place, it's about giving women, Indigenous women, girls, and to us LGBTQ people the supports needed so that they could regain their power and regain their place in society. We did, when the report, not long after that report was released, we did an initial response, but at the time we were facing the fall election. So it was determined that it would be an initial response to the final report, but that a more detailed response would be prepared at a later date. The Reclaiming Power and Place had a wide range of recommendations that were directed at all levels of government, including community governments, Indigenous governments, territorial governments, provincial and federal governments. So it was directed, and it was also directed at industry, developing industry, like the mines. There's also directed at Canadian and corrections service. some of those calls for justice, of which 231 of them were directed at different levels, but when we did our review, we looked at all 231 calls for justice. There was also a recommendation to have a national action plan developed, which was released on June 3rd of this year, 2021. And we participated by providing a couple of pages of just outlining what we're doing and how we're planning to develop the action plan. And that was, as I mentioned, released on June 3rd. There is also, the federal government also did their own response to the national calls for justice, and it's called the Federal Pathways to Address Missing Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. That was also released on June 3rd. Now, to me, that document is a lot more significant because they do talk about initiatives that they're going to put in place that would have a broader impact, for example, on provinces and territories. And when they presented their budget this year, there was, I believe, $2.2 billion that was allocated over 5 years. So we know the federal government has allocated, earmarked some funding. Okay, if we could, just a couple of things. Now, what has happened since then? Things slowed down quite a bit in the national level because of the elections that just took place. But there was a Missing Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Secretariat that was set up in Suriname. And some of you might have followed the news, the criticism that came out from Native Women's Association of Canada because a non-Indigenous male was appointed to head that secretariat. But things seem to be moving along. Okay. Maybe the next slide.
Thank you so much. Ms. Biscaye, are you able to move your microphone closer to you? It's coming through as quite muffled on our end, and I think it's just the distance that you are from your microphone if possible. Thank you so much.
Okay. So taking action, that was our work plan, and it was tabled on November 5th by a minister responsible for the status of women. And the work plan outlined how the GNWT plans to work on preparing and developing an action plan in response to the calls for justice. The work plan was meant to provide transparency on how the government is planning to prepare the action plan. In the work plan, we noted some overlap issues, things like family violence, intimate partner violence, gender-based violence are all interconnected with missing murdered Indigenous women and girls. And when we respond to the calls for justice, we will also be addressing some of those other overlap issues. We had a meeting to determine how we're going to approach this, and we had a meeting with all the directors of policy from the different departments, and we received really good feedback in that said it was really good to have all the directors in one room having a discussion on how we're going to be moving forward, how we see this work unfolding. So we had a couple of more meetings after that with directors, and that seemed to have been I think it helped departments to understand where we were getting at and what we needed, the things that we needed to take into consideration. We then did an in-depth review of each of the calls for justice and to look into what was the intent of the calls for justice. Why did they present that calls for justice? And then we looked at the programs and services that we are offering and to see, is it addressing it? And if it is addressing it, is it fully addressing it? Is it not addressing it? So forth. So after we did the analysis of the calls for justice to get an understanding of what it is, we did a review of our current programs and services, and that's where the summary report that was, I believe it was provided to the committee, that's where we came up with this. Now, we realize this is a self-assessment, and, other people may disagree with our self-assessment. and that's fine. That's the feedback we wanted to have. And the self-assessment, all the departments were asked to go back, take a look at all the calls for justice, and to let us know what current programs and services they are offering that would address this, and then identifying those that would need to be where a response would be required. Okay, next slide, please. Is the sound better now?
Yes, thank you very much. It's much better to hear you now.
Okay. So continue with the GNWT work plan. The work plan, in there we noted that the calls for justice are far-reaching and complex, and that developing an action plan would not be a simple process. We recognize that this would not be a checkbox approach, and that the GNWT would not be able to respond to each of the calls for justice. There was 231. Actually, there's more because some of them have some subheadings on there. So the development of the GNWT action plan would require careful review of what is currently being done and assessing its effectiveness. And we recognize that some of the calls for justice would take time because it would require a huge shift. And, and I think we also know that we wouldn't be able to get things done immediately because it does take time, especially legislation. The work also included a community engagement plan. In the work plan, we outlined that we're planning to do community engagement to get feedback on the draft action plan. And I should stress that this is a draft action plan, and the reason we call it a draft action plan is we're not planning to finalize it until we've gotten feedback from communities, because this is a government-produced document, and we want to check in with the people that's going to be impacting to make sure we are on the right track. Even though our intentions are well-meant, in community, people with lived experience, people that it's impacted may have a different expectation, may need something else different, and we need to hear that from the community people and from those that are impacted. In doing the community engagement, we plan to do a trauma-informed approach. And the work plan also spoke to a communications plan that would be included in the action plan. And that was for twofold. One is to raise public awareness about missing Indigenous women and girls, but it's also to advise and inform about the GNWT's action plan. We want people to be aware of. One of the things that we've found through the course of the work we've been doing, not that everybody in the community necessarily is informed on missing murdered Indigenous women and girls. So we want to make sure that the information is getting out there. The work plan also included a proposed timeline with target dates, and according to that, we were supposed to table the draft work plan in June of this year, but then the minister directed we do a preliminary engagement, which I think was a really good idea. And I think that helped also when we develop our plan to know that we are reflecting some of the concerns of communities. So because of that, the tabling of the action plan has been delayed to this upcoming session. Next slide, please. So with the preliminary engagement, when we were directed to do this, we worked and thought about which groups should we be providing update, doing a preliminary engagement with. So we proposed a 2-day workshop with some key stakeholders, and that was the Native Women's Association of the MFT, their board and staff, the board and staff of the NWT Status of Women Council. And also, we have these community contacts that we've been dealing with regularly. We have monthly meetings with them. And so we invited them also. We had 3 facilitated workshops here in Yellowknife in June. And those 3 workshops went very well. I was quite pleased with the participation, and some of the feedback that we got was captured in the What We Heard report. But they made some overarching recommendations and more specific recommendations to departments, which departments were told to keep in mind. We didn't manage to go through all the summary reports, but it was provided to the participants ahead of time, and we tried to get through as many as we can, just to try to get a sense of, if they agreed with us or not on our self-assessment. Most of the participants, there's some that said, no, we don't agree with this, and that was fine. Because at the end of the day, our instructions to all departments is you have to look at all the calls for justice when you're developing a response. And so that I think it was good to take that preliminary engagement process in the middle of this whole thing. Okay. If we could go to the next slide, please. So, preparing the draft action plan, instructions were issued to the departments in July, and the instructions that was developed, some of it flowed from the preliminary engagement. We advised them to take a look at the What We Heard report and review the overarching recommendations and then the more specific recommendations to try to address those. We also prepared a sample document, and when I say we, I'm talking about the working group also. We worked closely with the working group on some of this. And so the instructions went out on July 26th with a deadline of September 10th. And the sample document we gave them outlined what information we wanted, with the understanding that we would not necessarily, I think, use all the information, but the information that we get, we would put into a format that would be a little bit different than the template we provided. At the preliminary engagement, it was agreed that we would take a thematic approach with the action plan to be consistent with the national action plan. And the 4 thematic areas that we outlined was culture, justice, health and wellness, and human security. It was agreed that there was a discussion, and it was agreed that it is to our advantage to align with the national action plan and also with the federal pathways document. This puts us in, it positions us well to try to access any funding that the federal government makes available to communities and to other jurisdictions. Based on the direction provided by the working group, the departments were also advised that their departmental responses should be for a 3-year period, after which time the response to the calls for justice will be reviewed. And that would start in June of 2022 once the work action plan is finalized. But that doesn't mean that work isn't already starting on some of those. The work is already starting on some of those. And the reason they wanted, I think, a 3-year plan is it gives us enough time to be able to work on implementing the calls for justice, and it takes us into the next government. But it's short enough that if we're find out things are not working out that well, that it allows us a shorter time period to make those corrections. It also gives a time for the National Action Plan and the Federal Pathways document to be implemented. And if there's ways in which we can tie into those, I think it would be really good, and that's part of the reason why it was made into a 3-year plan. Currently, we're scheduled to table the draft action plan on December the 9th. And so we're planning to meet that deadline. Next page, please. Next slide, please. So when we're preparing the draft action plan, the vision statement that we came up with is, I'm not going to read it, well, I guess I should read it, is we envision an NWT where Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQIA plus people live free from violence, are respected and valued, have equitable access to programs and services, are honored and celebrated, and where their security is assured and provided no matter where they live. And this is slightly different wording than the National Action Plan, but it does align with that, and I think it's important that we do that. One of the things that I want to read that was quoted in the final submission for the Native Women's Association, and I forgot to mention that when they did their final submission, and they were the only Indigenous organization in the NWT who was a registered intervener, when they did their final submission, the GNWT, in our submission, we supported their 4 primary recommendations. And so we've embedded that in throughout the action plan. But one of the submissions, the quotes that we included in the submission is that we believe that changes in the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians that were called for in the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples have begun. We also believe that reconciliation has begun. Like any other relationship, it will need work and will face challenges. This is something that, we value our relationship with Native Women's Association, and we think, this statement is so true, and we need to build on the momentum. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, the 4 primary recommendations that were provided by the Native women. So we've adopted those 4 objectives to guide the change that has taken place across the NWT public service and in our relationship with Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQIA plus people. These objectives build on the 4 core recommendations, and I'll just read them really quickly. So they said we must acknowledge that violence against Indigenous women, girls, including members of the 2S LGBTQIA plus communities, is a crisis that demands an urgent active response. We must ensure that the purpose and objective of all government services is to be community and person-centered. We must reestablish, build, and foster trust between all levels of government, service providers, communities, and every one of their citizens. And we must establish a meaningful entity with accountability to monitor and evaluate the acknowledgement of government efforts towards rebuilding trust and establishment and outcomes from community and person-centered government services. The GNWT is committed to working with the Native Women's Association and its other partners on the implementation of the draft action on the GNWT action plan. And we are aware of and welcome public scrutiny on how well we are working on undertaking the actions we said we would in order to affect change. Next slide, please. So the report is the action plan is broken out into 4 parts. There's an introduction that provides background information and context upon which this document is built. And then we talk about acknowledging the crisis. We lay out the facts and the urgent need for a response and why. Then we talk about changing the relationship, and I believe earlier the minister had talked about, what it means to be in a relationship and all that entails. And so our vision statement and the objective for change is based on that premise. The action plan is meant to demonstrate that we recognize that we need to change how we do business, and especially our interactions with Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQIA plus people and Indigenous people in general. And we're hoping that this action plan will help start that and keep that momentum going. I should also note that responding to the last part is responding to the calls for justice, and this is where all the detailed actions that will be undertaken is formulated in that part 4. In the draft action plan, we also have, you'll notice in there's some divisions in the department that will be leading a lot of the changes, and that's highlighted in the action plan. We thought it was important. And it shows that it's not just about changing projects, it's how we do business. That means we need to make some changes internally. And so some of the departments have indicated that they're looking at that and reviewing that. We are also committed to, we are aware that, the importance of involving people from communities and people with lived experience. There's a number of service departments that have staff at the community level, and they do provide frontline service, and so they have the ability to be able to connect. And that was one of the things that the preliminary engagement said is make sure staff from the communities do have input. And that was the message that was shared with departments. We're also prepared to work with Indigenous governments and community governments to implement the action plan, and I think also try to work with them to help them prepare their own responses, how they're going to respond to the calls for justice. And I think through the community communications plan, making communities more aware of what's required, I think will help move some of that forward. Next slide, please. So the action plan includes community engagement and consultation plan, and that will be appended to the draft action plan. It'll outline how we intend to do the community engagement, to go out to do community visits. We're going to take a variety of approaches. We don't necessarily spell out in the community engagement consultation, but we're hoping to use all kinds of different approaches. It might mean an open house, maybe a community meeting. It might require briefings to Indigenous governments. We would be willing to go into communities, and we're invited to provide briefings. So we're planning to take a variety of approaches. One of the things that we're hoping to do, and Native Women has agreed to work with us on this, is we're hoping to do a community, start the community engagement process by holding a terminology workshop. When we're dealing with this subject, there's a lot of terminology that's being used on a regular basis, like trauma-informed, cultural safety, and all this. And we need to make sure that, because when we do community engagement, we may have to, we'll probably be providing interpreting services. So it's important to know for the interpreters to be consistent in, their understanding of the words that we're going to be using. So that's one of the things that we're hoping to work with, and Native Women has agreed to co-host a terminology workshop with us. We're hoping to do it in December, but it might be closer to January because of the COVID restrictions. Our preference is to have people come together in person. If not, we'll do it online. The other thing that we've been having meetings, we've met with our regular regional CERNAC office here in Yellowknife. They have some funds that are available to provide funds to communities to support victims and families that are affected by missing murders. They also have funds available to support victims of violence. And so they've agreed to us to include that information in the action plan in case anybody wants to apply for that funding to prepare for engagement events that may take place in their community. So the communications plan, just to go into this briefly, it's to create increased awareness on missing murder, Indigenous women and girls, and I think violence, any type of violence that's directed at women and girls and to us LGBTQ people. It's also to inform and seek feedback, so we want to share information on the draft action plan, make sure communities are aware of what's in there, what we're proposing, so that they can provide an informed feedback to us on our plans. And we also plan to take culturally safe and decolonized approach to make sure, ensure a strong voice for Indigenous women is reflected in the design and conduct of the community engagement. And again, for the community engagement, we're hoping to involve the Native Women's Association of the NWT, possibly the Status of Women Council, and we've also I've met with Rainbow Coalition, and they are interested in this work, and so they may be participating also. Next slide. So going forward, once we've done all the community engagement, we've tabled the draft action plan, and we've done the community engagement, and we received feedback. The aim right now is to undertake community engagement, hopefully starting in December, but it'll go till April, and then we'll take the month of May to do any revisions, and there will be reports prepared on the community engagement, so that, and we'll do follow-up. Any commitments that are made in those engagement sessions, we'll make sure we follow up on that, and then we'll revise the action plan and hopefully table it next June 2022, and the work will start moving forward. As I mentioned earlier, some of the work has already started, and so I think we'll hopefully, at the same time, we will also be tabling the annual report, which there's been a commitment to do every year. And finally, in terms of the implementation of the action plan, the Gender Equity Unit will continue to work with departments to make sure and get regular reporting. I mentioned right off the bat that, transparency is important. And so the annual reports will help us to report on the implementation of the annual report, the action plan. And finally, the Gender Equity Division will continue to participate at the FPT table, the Federal Provincial Territorial Working Group on Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. I was recently approached to co-chair that national committee. I agreed, so I'm now a co-chair for the FPT Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Working Group. Next slide. Before concluding the presentation, I just wanted to talk on some other related initiatives that we're also working on. So our Gender Equity Division now, it came into effect on April 1st. So we have a couple of positions that are going to be starting the Gender and Diversity analyst and officer position, and those two positions are going to be working closely with departments to make sure that GBA Plus is getting implemented. Also making sure that we're working on gender equality and equity throughout the government. So there's a number of things, and it's a fairly new division, so we're going to be learning as we're going, but we're getting some really good support and feedback from our FPT partners, but also from the others who have had similar experiences. We also have a family violence coordinator who was hired back in June, and she's been working with us on missing murder, but also doing her own background research, compiling information. And once COVID restrictions lift, we're hoping she can get into some of the communities to meet with people, organizations, and so forth to get some feedback on what people want to see in the family violence strategy, and then we'll begin working on that. She's developed a draft work plan that we still have to review and go through, but that's what's happening with the Gender Equity Division. We also, the Gender Equity Division also participates on the FPT table under that's hosted by the Federal Department of Women and Gender Equity. And one of the tasks that they're working on is developing a national action plan on gender-based violence. There was a ministerial statement that was issued in January of this year by all the ministers for the status of women. And the upcoming annual meeting of ministers is December, and there's supposed to be conditional approval of the framework document for the National Action Plan on Gender-Based Violence. There's also other work that's going on at the national level. There's work that's going on regarding cyber violence, human trafficking, and the sex trade industry. There's a lot of work happening, especially in some of the other larger provinces where some of this is a lot more prominent than it is in the Northwest Territories. There's also they call it a Gender-Based Violence Knowledge Center was set up by the Federal Department of Women and Gender Equality, and it provides information, and they also provide information sessions and things like that are open to people. And that information is shared with all our community contacts and with our partners. And anytime we receive any information on funding opportunities, we always make sure we widely distribute it. And I put partnerships in there because I think it's really important to stress that partnerships, we have established good partnerships with, Native Women's Association, Status of Women Council, and some of our community contacts. We realize we can't do this alone, and so we are trying to work with them closely. And the Rainbow Coalition, I've set up monthly meetings with them also just to keep updated. They're a fairly small, young organization, but they are doing good work or trying to do good work and working with some people in the community to identify as 2S LGBTQ people. So we're trying to make sure they're involved and that their input is sought and that they're given an opportunity. So, last slide, please. So just to conclude, I just want to acknowledge that I do appreciate, and especially when I say I mean us, the Gender Equity Division and the ministers, the importance that the MLAs have placed on this file. I think it's really good. We welcome the opportunity to do regular briefings. To me, the more that people know, the more active participation we can get. There's, other policy decisions such as incorporating GBA plus in the decision-making process. These changes signal a change in attitude in the way we do business. Violence against against women, girls, and 2S LGBTQIA people is unacceptable, but it's still prevalent in the NWT. And it has a wide impact because it just doesn't affect them, it also affects their children, their extended family, and their communities as a whole. So this has to be a whole of territory approach. I think there's a lot of acknowledgement on the root causes of the violence. There's alcohol abuse, residential schools, poverty, low education levels, lack of economic opportunities. And I think we have a role to play in ending violence against women and girls, but we all have to carry the same message. And if we all carry the same message, I think it becomes quite powerful. So the work plan that we're developed, we're hoping to start by trying to change the relationship we have, and through the actions that have been proposed, those changes we'll start seeing those changes happening, and changes. It's not just in changing the way we do business, but it's also a change in attitude and perspective and so forth. So thank you for the opportunity to do the presentation. I'll turn it back to the minister now.
Thank you very much, Ms. Biscaye. I really appreciate the time that you took to put the presentation together and to also come and join committee. Before I say anything, I'd like to turn it over to Minister Wozniak. Minister, did you have anything that you wanted to add before we open it up?
Thanks, Madam Chair, and thank you to Sabet for the presentation on my behalf as well. And again, just to echo what she said, that we do appreciate the emphasis that is being put on this work. It is, I find, an overwhelming topic, and can, I think, go one of two ways, where we can just be overwhelmed by it, and then it becomes unwieldy and difficult to discuss meaningfully. But it can also be a real opportunity to do the kind of change, to kind of really look at how we do business, why we do business, how do we hold ourselves accountable as government, as departments, individually and collectively. And so by being asked to appear and by having all of you here today, that I think is part of that relationship change that we really have seen as being so fundamental. So yeah, I'm grateful for being here. And I guess the only other comments I'd make is to reiterate again, or to reflect again, the centrality of relationship within all of this. One of the things that the action plan will not necessarily be is sort of parsed out one by one, suggesting that there's a magic solution to what is, again, was termed as a genocidal level problem. There's not, but there are ways to make this to do differently and to do better. So having the opportunity to communicate, to share and to hear and to acknowledge that we will not get it right all the time, and we will not necessarily get it right the first time, but that we're going to continue because we value the relationships. So with that, Madam Chair, we are very happy to take any questions or hear comments that the committee might have. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Minister Wozniak, and yes, thank you again to Ms. Biscaye for the presentation. And I also want to draw attention to the comment about changing the way we do business, because that to me signals the whole of government approach to this action plan, and I think that's incredibly important and needs to be a pillar of how this goes forward. Committee, I'd like to turn it over to committee members for any comments or questions for both Minister Wozniak and Ms. Biscaye. And committee, who would like to go first? MLA Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the presenters. I think we are starting a lot of good work, which will review our current processes and perhaps start some of that we all know are needed to move this file forward. But I guess I would like the Minister to speak to funding potential for some federal, through their National Action Plan and other funding pools, to fund a lot of the calls to justice. But in our action plan specifically, are we going to have it costed, or are there going to be funded? Is there going to be funding allocated when it is tabled? Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, MLA Johnson. Minister Wozniak.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So, of course, there's not new funding that gets appropriated to anything that the government does without going through the main estimates processes. So this action plan is no different in that regard. It doesn't have special funding that comes from somewhere else. The course of seeing the different actions being undertaken by departments or that are being proposed by departments will go through the business planning process like anything else. And I think you'll see that some of what the work that's underway has indeed gone through that process, and so will be reflected in due course in what departments are asking the funding to do. But a big part of the reason, well, I shouldn't say a big part, certainly a reason that we have structured our action plan to reflect the themes that are in the federal plan is precisely because there's been a very significant commitment in the last federal budget to fund initiatives under the National Action Plan in response to the National Inquiry. So the more that we can demonstrate that we are a reflection of those goals and ideals, but in a way that is appropriate to the territories, it is our hope, although I'm going to say expectation, that we will find that it's all the easier to then to find ourselves reflected in the funding that's going to become available. Thanks, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Minister Wozniak. Emily Johnson.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. I guess I'll just leave a bit of a comment in that this goes beyond this action plan. There's a few action plans in the GNWT that have costed frameworks, and I think even a couple times in history, a department has been successful in going to FMB and getting funding for action plan. And I struggle with some of the items in here, tasking anyone with them without funding. And I guess also I think perhaps the action plan should speak to some of the realities, that the calls to justice call for safe, adequate, and secure housing. We know that's a $500 million problem in the territory. That calls for a guaranteed livable income. We know that's a $100 million costed thing in the Northwest Territories. I would love to see that in this action plan, but I don't expect there to be numbers or that to be even covered in this. So I guess, can I just, the minister, speak to some of those areas that perhaps fall outside of this action plan, given their fiscal realities? Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Emily Johnson. Minister Wozniak.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, I think so. Good news and bad news, I guess. But let me start with or perhaps it's just the reality news, which is that the way that funding gets allocated is done within the fiscal framework that we've approved for the 19th Legislative Assembly, which makes it difficult for any one department to come forward and say, here, I've got a great idea, even if everyone supports it, if it is something that falls outside of the fiscal framework that's already been made, that was already approved. Add the layer of the COVID crisis to that and what that's done to revenues and expenditures. And it's very difficult to come forward with something outside of the mandate and sort of somehow get initiatives funding for that, because there's just not funding readily available. But the good news, at least what I'm going to term as good news, is, again, this isn't an action plan that is necessarily focused on, doing one specific thing to fix, again, what has been termed genocide. It is looking at how we do all the things, why we do all the things. So it have a response in it from where housing is looking at the work that's underway, but putting it in the framework of doing that to respond to the call to justice. Looking at, for example, what is income security doing when they're doing a review, and are they bringing this lens of being, person-centered, being trauma-informed, and having a lens of the impacts on Indigenous women, girls, 2S, LGBTQ, and QIA people? Because that takes what the work that they do and makes it a more, I think, again, adds to this relationship. I can give you one last example, which is not the big picture of housing and income support, but it happens to be something that I'm responsible for. And it's over at ITI, and we're doing work in terms of socioeconomic agreements, which, might not necessarily seem directly related, but it's part of the work of government. It impacts on communities. It is something where traditionally there's, the leadership that tends to be at the table may not necessarily reflect the women and girls in a community, and it may. But as government, we need to now answer ourselves with that lens to say, are we doing enough to ensure that we are truly reflecting the needs and the safety and the health and the wellness of a community when we are entering into those agreements? So again, this action plan is a way of creating that change and creating that different way of doing things and why we do things. And sorry, Madam Chair, I just realized I gave a really long answer. I will try to be more brief next time. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Minister Wozniak. Members, does anybody else have any additional questions or comments for Minister Wozniak or Ms. Biscaye? Emily Johnson?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm never short on questions. I guess I'd like to hear how we're approaching there's a few very clear and explicit legislative changes required in the calls to justice. One is for all territories, provinces, and federal government to pass missing persons legislation. A number of jurisdictions have kind of responded to that have passed or already had missing persons legislation. That's a very specific one, but there's definitely some others that would be required. I just knowing the government very restricted view of adding any more legislation to the queue in this assembly, and knowing this is a 3-year action plan, do we anticipate any legislation coming out of the calls to justice? Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, MLA Johnson. Minister Wozniak.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So, Madam Chair, again, this did go through all departments and go through all of their policy folks. I wasn't necessarily intending this to be, like an actual preview of what specific responses are in the action plan. I know that was addressed there. I was trying to find it quickly as I was speaking, but maybe I'll turn it over to Sabet and see. I mean, she would have been there for those discussions, and again, rather than me looking for the specifics on that one question, I gather the question was more general and in broad in terms of what broadly our department's going to do. So let me turn it back to Sabet if she wants to, if I could, Madam Chair, and see if she can speak to that in a general sense. And I'm happy to take a follow-up on that as well. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Minister Wozniak. Ms. Biscaye.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. Ryland, for the question. With regards to that, I don't want to get into the specific actions that have been in there. All I'm going to say is right now we have close to 90 actions that we're proposing to take. Earlier, I had mentioned that we didn't want to take a checkbox approach to our response, so we're covering it under those 4 areas. But there are some legislation that we recognize that we would have to respond to and address, and we also recognize that it does take time. And so we may not have addressed everything, but that doesn't mean we're not planning to. It's just going to take some background work. There's also, I think there's some departments might be looking into other areas, but we want to make sure what we present in the action plan is doable and that we're not waiting, for example, on funding becoming available before we do it. We wanted to make sure the action plan that we have now, that we present, is something that we have the resources to do. And that, so and that includes any legislation that might be required. What I will say is some of the actions include doing reviews of current policies and doing reviews of current programs and services in case there needs to be any modifications. And one of the things that's been stressed to departments that are planning to do that is the need to involve and get input from communities and from people with lived experience. So yes, we recognize the missing persons legislation is one of the ones that's been pushed for, and we're hoping to respond to that in the action plan.
Thank you very much, Ms. Biscaye. MLA Johnson.
No. I think, yeah, thank you. I will save further questions for when we get the draft to further conversations. I just bring up the issue of funding and legislative kind of timelines in that they are just, they're kind of out of any one person's control. I recognize funding has to go through cabinet and then get approved by the legislature, and inherently legislation as well. So I know we have many action plans across government where those 2 items have failed despite the best intentions of a department. And it's left, there's a stack of legislative amendments proposed in action plans that never got brought forward, and funded programs that, didn't actually get the money. That's no surprise. I bring them up to, make sure that we are having the foresight, because this is clearly a priority for everyone and a plan we want to see properly funded and implemented. So thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, MLA Johnson. I'll take that as a comment. Members, are there any additional questions or comments for Minister Wozniak or Ms. Biscaye? I do have a quick question. The last time that we... sorry. Go ahead, MLA O'Reilly. If you had a question, I couldn't see your hand on the screen. Go ahead.
Okay, thanks, Madam Chair. I recognize that there's probably been a lot of work done on this, and it's kind of hard to talk about a plan in the abstract when we just have a few slides that start to talk a little bit about what its content is. But if the minister can find a way to table the report in the House before the last day of the sitting, December the 9th, I think that would be more helpful, because then it would allow MLAs to comment on it in the House before we have to wait until February or March of next year. So I just would like to try to encourage the minister to not table it on the last day of the sitting. Thanks, Madam Chair.
Thank you, MLA O'Reilly. Minister Wozniak?
Thanks, Madam Chair, and thanks, Emily O'Reilly. We initially had, of course, been planning to table it in this session that would have been ongoing already. So I don't know why that date was selected. I gather there's a lot of back and forth that happen in terms of understanding business that goes on. So let me take that away with Sabet, and we'll see if we can accelerate that. I also agree. I mean, to me, to be a living document, to be a draft on which we want meaningful conversations means that a big part of that certainly is going to be discussion in the House. So like I say, we'll figure it out if that's possible or not. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that, Minister Wozniak. MLA O'Reilly?
Thanks for that. Yeah, I appreciate the minister's going to look at that. As far as I know, there are no rules that say there's a maximum number of documents that can be tabled in any day, whatever. That's more of a cabinet House planning matter. So I'm sure that the minister is going to talk to her colleagues to get that date moved up. Thanks, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, MLA O'Reilly. Members, are there any additional questions for Minister Wozniak? Hearing none, I do have a couple of really quick questions for the minister. The last time that we got together, we did have discussion about a federal announcement of funding that would come to provinces and territories in order to implement their own action plans. And there was some unknown around whether or not the figure was just for the NWT or how that would be divided among provinces and territories. I did hear Emily Johnson's question today that related to that as well, and I understand that there is still some unknown around what that financial figure might be, and I'm wondering if the federal government has indicated a range of funding or at least a timeline. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll turn over to Sabet again in a moment. If I could, the officials level will get the latest that is available to us. But the funding was announced, and then I think they pretty well went on their election shutdown period shortly thereafter. So to my knowledge, there's not been specific discussion as to how the funding that they allocated in the budget will get distributed, whether it'll be funding program by program or per capita or some combination thereof. And the next FPT or federal, provincial, territorial meeting is not scheduled until the first full week of December. So while I expect we'll get some more detail before that meeting, that would probably be the first opportunity that I would have formally to receive or to discuss that with the federal ministers. But as I said, the officials level might have some inkling more. So if I could, I'd suggest we ask the same question, please.
Thank you so much, Minister Wozniak. Ms. Biscaye?
Thank you very much. And in terms of the funding from the federal government, as I mentioned in the presentation, the federal government had indicated $2.2 billion over 5 years. Some of that money was already allocated to federal departments like Women and Gender Equality, CERMAC, and Public Safety. So I think some of the funding is being dispersed, but because of the elections, it did slow down the process a bit, but I know their work is gearing up. When you look at the federal pathways document, in there, they made a number of commitments. One of the ones that they've committed to is to provide stable, longer-term funding to be provided to Indigenous women and to LGBTQ organizations to ensure that the voices of Indigenous women and gender diverse people are reflected in all aspects of life. So some of that funding will be made available. There's also, they've indicated that they'll do funding available for data management and so forth. That's one of the things that we've noticed is data management, and some of the action plans, what they're planning to do, for example, in some of our departments, is they're going to start looking at collecting data, because that's an area that was identified as needing a lot of work to be done. And so at the national level and also at the territorial level, we're looking at data management. How do we collect it? How disaggregated data and all that. So there is funding that's going to be made available at the national level. How some of that funding is going to be dispersed hasn't yet been identified, but I think in the co-chair position, it does provide me with access to some information, which I'm quite pleased about. But the federal pathways, we've gotten clear direction that the federal pathways document is what the federal government's going to be working on, and the funding that has been allocated is going to be working on implementing that. And so there's a number of initiatives. That means, the way I interpret it, funding is going to go to the communities, the jurisdictions, some of the provinces, some territories, so forth. And I think there's some discussion with the federal government on bilateral agreements with some jurisdictions. I hope that provides clarification.
Thank you very much, Ms. Biscaye. I really appreciate that. My next question is in regards to something that Minister Wozniak brought up, and that was, as minister also responsible for ITI, the minister is able to look at the work that ITI is doing to have that, breaking down of silos and a whole of government approach to how does the work that's being done with this action plan relate to work within other departments. But what I'm wondering is, what kind of teeth does this action plan have to be able to, once a policy within another department is identified as infringing on the safety of Indigenous women and girls, what teeth does this policy have in order to go to that department and say, no, this takes precedence? This policy needs to be changed because of this. So kind of flipping the narrative of not maintaining the status quo because it infringes on safety, and making the department thus then find a new way of going about achieving what the policy's goal was. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Madam Chair. I mean, that's it's interesting, almost, I wouldn't say it's more important than the financial piece attached to an action plan. Maybe it's not more important, but perhaps for this kind of an issue and this kind of a challenge, I would go so far as to say that it is actually more important. And the reason for that is that if we can truly change the way that government, from ministers through to those at the front lines delivering on our services and our programs, if we can truly change that the cultural approach that we use when we do what we do as public servants, that's when we will see the kind of social change and cultural change and fundamental relationship change that I think is spoken to in the National Inquiry. How will you get there? This is where, again, we talk about acknowledging, having adopted the primary recommendations of the Native Women's Association of the Northwest Territories. I'll just go back to them, because you start out by actually acknowledging that this is indeed a crisis, and that beyond just being a crisis, the National Inquiry, in fact, defined it as a genocide. If you're going to truly accept that and acknowledge that, well, then you can't not act, right? You can't not respond if you, in fact, understand what those words and appreciate what those words are telling you is happening. And then, the idea of building and rebuilding trust, once again, to me, if you're in a leadership role in government, as a minister certainly, but even the leadership exists throughout the public service, well, then you have a responsibility. If you've just acknowledged the magnitude of what's happening, you have a responsibility to act on it. So, but the last one is about accountability. And that's, I think, a big part of this is setting up that stage for who are the change makers responsible within government to deliver on this action plan, and what's going to happen to do that. So, that's where there's the obvious things, I think, of an annual report tabled in the House, keeping, public accountability in the Legislative Assembly, in that formal political sense of what is happening and what is taking place. I expect that there will be, something from all ministers reflective of all departments of the role that they have to play here. And then, of course, there's, as I think Sabet said earlier, including things like gender-based plus analysis, which that takes time to do well and to do effectively. But the fact that there's a willingness to get there to the point that we're going to be able to do it, all of that helps to bring that accountability. So, I hope you don't mind that that's a big answer, but I think it's a big question because we are all going to be accountable as ministers. At the same time, there has to be a point of accountability, and that's where it's going to have to come down to each minister responsible for each department and each deputy minister responsible for that department. So I think the way that this is being structured, the expectations that departments have all gone through to contribute themselves, and then the different pieces of that puzzle around watching what they're doing, I am hopeful that this is going to achieve that goal. Thanks, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Minister Wozniak. Members, are there any additional questions for Minister Wozniak before we move on and let them go? Hearing and seeing none, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you both for your presentation today and your time and your answers to our questions. Committee very much looks forward to having the report tabled hopefully towards the beginning of session rather than the end, because we would like the opportunity to discuss the report in its entirety with your team as well. So thank you very much for your time today, and thank you for helping us keep this very important topic and this action plan top of mind of the work of the GNWT, and we thank you for that.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, committee. Have a great day.
Committee, if you can stay on the line for a few minutes while we turn off the live feed, it would be much appreciated. And as always, thank you to the public for joining us today.